scientists believe that the vampires were used to drinking blood from people originated from Slavic folklore. Vampire comes from the Old Slavonic ghoul, upir. They have been mentioned in Slavic literature since the 14th century. The legends about vampires flourished most vividly not in Transylvania but in Serbia. But in Transylvania they had never heard of vampires in ancient times. There these creatures were called strigoi, but during the life of Vlad Dracula, no one was particularly afraid of vampires. The real craze for these creatures began much later, in the 18th century in Eastern Europe. There was real panic. It all started in East Prussia, with numerous complaints about vampire attacks. In 1721, two famous cases of vampire attacks on villages occurred in Serbia. Both stories were investigated by government officials, and numerous documents have been preserved about them. In one Serbian village, the deceased returned 2 weeks after the funeral and asked his son for food. His son refused and was found dead. Then 8 more neighbors died from loss of blood, who before his death said that the dead man came to them and drank blood. An official named Frombald, to whom the villagers complained, ordered the grave to be opened in the presence of a priest. Frightened people saw the body of the ghoul, untouched by decomposition. They burned it, and the mysterious deaths in the village stopped. The second famous vampire was Arnaud Pavlet. After his death, fellow villagers began to die in mass, and the survivors said that the Pavlet was haunting them. The authorities opened the grave and discovered a perfectly preserved body and a coffin full of blood, after which they pierced the ghoul with a stake and burned it. Vampire attacks on this village, however, resumed 6 years later. After the death of 12 people on January 12, in 1731, the Austrian doctor Glaser arrived in the village of Medveji. He tried to attribute the deaths to malnutrition, but when the villagers insisted on exhumation, he was shocked that many of the bodies had not decomposed. The doctor called the reinforcements, a commission of military surgeons headed by Johann Plackenger, who conducted an investigation and found out that almost half of those killed by vampires did not decompose. On his orders, all the dead were pierced with a stake and burned. After the story of the vampire Pavlet, real hysteria swept across Europe. Cases of vampire attacks began to be recorded outside of Serbia. And they even proposed creating a quarantine zone around Serbia. An entire generation lived in wild fear of vampires. Peasants dug up graves en masse and stuck stakes into the dead. In 1749, all the information collected by authorities was published by the respected French theologian and scientist Antoine-Augustin Calmet in his treatise. This is what a government official who visited the epicenter of the vampire epidemic told him. He was informed that in these parts it is considered quite common to meet a person who has died some time ago. This man returns to the village, sits down at the table with his friends without saying a word, and makes a sign with his head to one of those present, who inevitably dies a few days later. The Austrian Empress Maria Theresa was forced to send her personal doctor Gerard von Swieten to investigate the matter. He went to the sites of the attacks and wrote the entire treatise. Research into the existence of ghosts, in which he came to the conclusion that vampires do not exist. After which the Empress forbade opening graves and desecrating bodies. So the vampire epidemic ended, but the legend of vampires continued to live. The next epidemic broke out in the 18th and 19th centuries in the New England, on the east coast of the United States. People believed that vampires would attack them and drink their blood, and farming families would dig up their dead beloved ones to cut off their heads and then burn their remains. The most famous story involves 19-year-old Mercy Brown. She was called the last of the Rhode Island vampires. She died in 1882, when 2 months later her father and their family doctor took out her body. They gasped. There was dried blood on her lips, and she herself lay not as well laid in the coffin, but on her side. Her heart was cut out and burned. Farmers cited grey skin, blood dripping from the mouth, and sunken eyes among the symptoms of the mysterious epidemic of vampirism. But today, scientists believe that these symptoms are very similar to tuberculosis, and blood dripped from the mouth after coughing. It is these events that are believed to have given rise to the terrible fear of vampires in modern culture.